here as well. Joel, can I just start with you? You worked in the Obama State Department. This is going to ripple through our politics today in a major way. What is your initial reaction?
That this is a travesty of justice. The equating of Hamas terrorists with the elected leader of a sovereign government, a democratic state, is just such a profound inversion of the principle of justice. There is no doubt that the war in Gaza that Israel is conducting is fierce, difficult, and painful, and harming Palestinian civilians. But the idea that somehow that is equal to an unprovoked terrorist assault led by Hamas, and Yahya Sinwar, the leader here who's named, that unprovoked attack somehow is equal now, the Israeli response is equal now to that in the eyes of the International Court of Justice, and that now any terrorist state knows that it can take down a sovereign state's leader if it conducts an attack. It just boggles the mind, and it shreds the UN's credibility.
Stephen Collinson, what do you see in this big picture? Obviously, there are a lot of people here in the United States who are concerned about the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza. The president has been grappling with protests over that. But to Joel's point, I mean, this is a pretty remarkable step that, you know, it says Hamas and Israeli leaders right now in our Cairo.
Right, it's extraordinary, and it's going to have massive international implications. The thing I think of most immediately is how this impacts into the politics in Israel, how it is likely to make Prime Minister Netanyahu feel even more that he's going this alone if he has to. That may cause him to take an even more hard line on this issue in Rafah, and that all rebounds back to the United States, and it sharpens this very difficult political position that the president is in, because critics of Netanyahu in the U.S. will see this as vindication for their criticisms of the operation into Gaza, and I just wonder how this will go down among the president's political advisors as we head into the critical point of a campaign where this is going to be a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, Joel, how do you see the likely response from the Biden administration on this? Because, I mean, we know that Senator Tom Cotton, for example, has already put out a letter in anticipation of this, saying essentially that he is going to make it impossible for ICC officials to even operate in the U.S., basically try to use powers to do that. What do you expect in terms of a response from the Biden team on this?
Well, the ICC is an entity we've always had a difficult relationship with the United States. And I think that President Biden, he's going to point to the reality, which is that Hamas started this war, this conflict, and that he is working, President Biden, that is working to end it, and working with the Israeli leadership and the prime minister on a plan for the day after, and what would that look like, and all of those points he'll continue to reiterate. But I think he's going to point out in the big picture that this is not appropriate, that we do not compare sovereign states directly in courts of law and their leaders, their elected leaders, to the heads of terrorist organizations. And I think he'll stand firm on that principle.
Yeah. Karen Finney is with us as well. I mean, Karen, this is obviously something that the Biden team has had to grapple with. Do you think Joel is right?
I do, although I think this is a prime example of how different it is. What you may do politically and what you may need to say politically is so very different than what you need to do diplomatically. And this exerts so much more pressure on the president, given this dynamic, the dynamic with Republicans in Congress. You had Elise Stefanik over the weekend, Congresswoman in Israel, criticizing President Biden. And I think in the context, as we were speaking about this earlier this morning, with what's just happened in Iran. So it's just a huge stew of, I would say, international chaos in many ways, and yet how you handle that from a diplomatic and a national security framework is not necessarily going to be what he will need to do and say politically.
And just from a practical standpoint, what happens when you have a stateless entity that is in a region that the ICC claims to have jurisdiction over, which is Palestine, Gaza, I believe West Bank, Joel, you can correct me on this, but not Israel, which is not a member of the ICC. So how does the ICC even have teeth to go after Israeli leadership and these stateless bodies? It's just what I mean is it's a legal gray area in this space of international law, if it might have just been a public statement from the ICC to step in and say, we are doing something about these two entities that we are equating with each other. But as a practical matter, nothing, I think, really happens in terms of sanctions on anybody, right?
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it comes off like a premeditated political punishment of the Israeli leadership that apparently they were thinking about this for months and warning for months. That's not a legal operation. That's a political operation. It's unfortunate. It pains me to say that because someone who believes in international cooperation, multilateralism, the United Nations, we need to have credible institutions there that do uphold the rule of law. And this idea that what is now the ICC going to go in and go into Gaza and find Sinwar and arrest him and bring him to trial, that's nonsense. And so it's ultimately, in the practical world, going to make it much harder for the Israeli leadership to execute their duties as sovereign heads of state of a democratic country. It's going to make it much harder for them. It's not going to have any real impact on Hamas.
Stephen, we've seen the travails, and you mentioned kind of what's going on inside Israel right now. I mean, Netanyahu kind of had a setback potentially over the weekend with Benny Gantz, a part of his coalition government, coming out and saying that he's, if he doesn't change course, he's going to leave. Then, of course, you had some comments also from Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, who we hear is also one of these people here. What impact does this have in terms of, it strikes me that it might actually strengthen Netanyahu's hand inside Israel. What's your view of how we should be interpreting that?
Right, I think it's going to be very difficult now for Gantz to come out and follow up his statement that he might leave, which is, it's been bubbling up for a long time and it's been expected. We've seen these tensions inside the coalition, a very right-wing coalition that Netanyahu is reliant on very right-wing parties that are also forcing his hand. But just domestically, politically, when the Prime Minister is perceived as under attack from the outside, it's going to be very difficult for that to kind of, that fracturing of the cabinet from Gallant's point of view to take place.
Yeah, Joel, you're very familiar with the internal politics of Israel. How do you look at this question?
Yeah, I concur completely. Look, we were just seeing a bit of a tipping point now in Israeli politics where the senior leaders of the war cabinet were opposing Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent decisions related to a ceasefire for a hostage deal, his day after planning. They're going to now pull back because they're going to be seen as essentially throwing Netanyahu to the wolves, and they themselves can end up following him there. And I think it makes it harder now for them to raise significant opposition domestically. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, to Stephen's point, look, he's playing to his right-wing base. He needs to keep his coalition intact, and he has them very firm. This will only strengthen his hand domestically.
We shouldn't lose sight of the fact, too, that Netanyahu has legal problems of his own in Israel.
Absolutely.
Right, which is part of why he wants to remain in power there.
He's exactly, and in many ways, he has continued to keep himself immune from that prosecution because of this governing coalition.
Yeah, Karen, the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu, we know, has actually been pretty fraught.
Yes.
And it was one that he tried to keep pretty behind the scenes in the beginning, but has since been more public and in pushing back against some of what Netanyahu has done here. How do you expect him to balance a response to this with that relationship that he has with Netanyahu?
Well, I think it certainly puts pressure on him, as we were just saying. It puts him Netanyahu more in a corner, and I think therefore demands some kind of a comment from the president of support. At a time when, as we know, he is also trying to press Netanyahu to prioritize getting the hostages out, not making the full assault on Rafah. So how that conversation, I think, unfolds today will be very interesting to hear a readout in terms of, because again, I think it becomes more important to reaffirm the reaffirmation of support that we've heard from the president.
Yeah, all right.